This is the latest bonded international whiskey release from Killowen, and it is really unique. Let me tell you about it in this week's review. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the Whiskey Nerd, and like I said, this is the latest bonded international release from Killowen, so let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now first off, Killowen were very kind and they did send me a bottle of this whiskey a few weeks ago to do a review. I did a quick review on Instagram and now I'm doing a proper whiskey review. This is though not going to influence my review of the whiskey because I do think it's quite unique, it's quite interesting and quite tasty, so these are independent thoughts. So with that out of the way, let's get into what makes this whiskey super unique. So this whiskey wasn't actually made by Killowen because they've only recently started being able to put out their own whiskey that they aged themselves. Up to now they've been sourcing whiskey, and this whiskey they sourced from the Belgrove Distillery in Tasmania. Now Belgrove is a really interesting distillery. It's founded by Peter Bignell, and he is super focused on sustainability. He has a crazy sustainable ethos. Like, he uses upcycled kind of farm machinery to make the whiskey. He uses the spent grains that he uses for the whiskey for animal feed. He fires his stills with like reclaimed oil from the local restaurant. So he's very focused on sustainability, but that doesn't mean he's making a bad whiskey, because this is super tasty and super unique. And the uniqueness of this whiskey starts off with the mash bill, starting off with 70% unmalted oats, 5% unmalted wheat, 5% unmalted barley, 10% malted barley and 10% malted rye. This is definitely a whiskey that will catch your eye because that is such a unique mash bill. Like, oats are hard to work with to begin with, and using 70% oats in a whiskey is going to be a very difficult process, but one that should yield a very interesting product. It is coming in at 3 years old, but they have used a number of casks in the aging of the whiskey to give it a bit of a unique kind of spin and a bit of a unique characteristic. So it was aged in Tasmanian Pinot Noir casks and ex-malt whiskey casks before it was sent to Killowen, and they gave it their signature rum and raisin finish, where they finished the whiskey in rum barrels from their own distillery, from their own rum, and in PX sherry casks. This is going to give you that kind of rum and raisin finish, so it should have a really nice deep amount of fruitiness in there to complement all those interesting grain notes. And that kind of collaboration isn't something that we should expect to stop now that Killowen are able to put out some of their own whiskey. I expect that their bonded international series is going to have a lot more life to it because they've got some really good connections with other micro distilleries around the world, so we should see lots more whiskies in this series coming down the line. And one final note on it before I go in for the nose: it comes in at cask strength of 59.42%, so it has a lot of weight and a lot of heft in the glass. So let's go in for the nose. Cheers. Now, one thing to note about the nose on this whiskey that you might not get in other whiskies is the Maillard reaction. So I'm not going to get into the science behind the Maillard reaction, but essentially what happens is when sugars caramelize, they go brown. So this could happen in steak, it could happen in chicken, it can happen in oats. It's what gives bread that kind of crusty characteristic on the outside. So as you cook oats, this Maillard browning happens, and it gives kind of this sweet kind of texture, and the longer you cook it, the more deep those flavors get. Eventually they'll go into kind of like a bitter, kind of a savoury note. So for this whiskey, they definitely roasted those oats heavily, and you do get a kind of a savoury characteristic coming through the nose. It's a lot less sweet than you might get with, let's say, if they had just cooked it a little bit. It's definitely more of a savoury characteristic coming through on the nose. But that's not to say it's not sweet. So if you imagine like the top of a creme brulee where you've like blowtorched it, where the sugar has caramelized and then started to burn a little bit, it's still quite sweet, but definitely has some of those kind of sharper notes coming through. It's definitely got that kind of characteristic with that kind of burnt brown sugar coming through it. There's also some kind of like sweet oats, not unlike kind of like bread dough that's being baked, but that's kind of coming through, as well as some kind of dark red berries. I mean, with the PX sherry, with the Pinot Noir aging, like, you would expect to get some berries coming through, and it definitely does come through. As for the alcohol burn, now it does come in at 59.42%, and normally I'm a guy who loves his cask strength whiskey, but for this one I do think it is a little hot, so I will be adding a few drops of water to it. But first, let's taste the palate without any water. Cheers. Okay, like I said, still with that kind of toasted oats, maybe kind of roasted oats, almost into like a roasted hazelnut kind of vibe, where you get that little bit of a savoury characteristic coming through. Not really getting any berries coming through. I am getting a lot of that kind of heavy charred, kind of caramelized brown sugar note, and a good bit of heat from the alcohol coming through. So while normally, as I said, I'm on that cask strength Crusade, I am going to add a few drops of water to it, because I do think after you add a little bit of water to this whiskey, it does come alive, and it does let you share those really nice, tasty, kind of fruity notes that you've got in the nose. You get those into the palate. So let's go in for the nose again. Cheers. Okay, definitely much lighter, much more approachable, much more kind of soft. Getting almost like a kind of a creamy, kind of custardy texture coming through. Like with oats, you'd expect to get this creamy kind of roundness coming through, and without water at that high ABV, I was getting, like I said, a kind of bread doughy vibe, but here it's more like that creamy kind of porridge vibe coming through. I'm still getting the same berries that I was getting. Like on the nose of the first time around, I was getting berries, but now it's almost like a chocolate covered cherry. Like those sharper kind of savoury notes have been pared back a little bit to be almost like a dark chocolate, and you get this kind of dark chocolate coated cherry vibe coming through. So let's go in for the palate with water. Cheers. Again, much softer, much more approachable. Still getting that kind of roasted hazelnut vibe, but it's definitely pared back a bit. I'm definitely getting much more of that red wine influence. Getting that PX sherry influence coming through with some nice kind of stewed berries. That heat from the ABV that's been pared back lets me kind of taste some of those more kind of soft notes that aren't being hidden by that high proof in the whiskey. And definitely though leading in with a lot of caramelized notes. So if you've ever seen those street vendors where they have those kind of roasted nuts with the kind of the brown sugar on the outside that's been caramelized, that's what you're getting here. Like that Maillard reaction has given us loads of really deep, dark caramel notes combined with the kind of nuttiness I'm getting. It does kind of remind me of those kind of caramelized roasted nuts you can sometimes buy on the side of the street. So let's go in again, but we're going to talk about the finish. Cheers. Okay, on the finish, I definitely have that ABV. Like I added a nice bit of water to it, so I have pared it down. It's probably at maybe about 45 to 50% ABV. Has come down in strength. Does have a nice bit of heat, has a nice bit of tingle there, but in terms of the flavors that are fading off, that nuttiness, that caramelized nuttiness, that's definitely hanging on. The berries, the red wine, the kind of PX sherry influence, that's kind of fading off. I'm getting almost like a dark chocolate vibe. I know I said there was a bit of like a dark chocolate coated cherry vibe coming through, but if you imagine like really rich dark cocoa, like really heavy, like 95% cocoa dark chocolate, that kind of vibe is hanging on. Getting nice little bit of like almost bitterness, but not like unpleasant bitterness, that nice kind of chocolatey bitterness coming through with that nuttiness as it all fades off. So yeah, this is a very super interesting, different kind of whiskey. I mean, I've never really seen a whiskey with that much oats and with that kind of caramelization on the grains that has definitely come through into the finished product. I mean, I do think it comes alive with a few drops of water added to it to kind of break down that heat, to let you get into the rest of the notes that are hidden behind it. But I do appreciate Killowen always put out cask strength whiskey, so even though it is at 59.42%, you don't have to drink it at 59.42. You can add a few drops of water, you can make it a bit softer, you can make it a bit more approachable to your palate. But one thing you can never do is add back alcohol. You can never take away water, so it is like you're getting two whiskeys in the one glass. You can kind of taste the whiskey as it came out of the cask, and then you can add a bit of water if you think it needs it to soften it up and to make it a bit more approachable. So thanks again to Killowen for sending me this bottle. I'm definitely going to keep on enjoying it. If you like the review, maybe scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews on Wednesdays and cocktail recipes on Fridays, so if you want to see more, make sure you hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Let's launch it.